Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter and Dave, two of our pastors here at Fellowship, are joining me today. Welcome. I'm so glad you're with me.
Good to be here with you, Autumn.
Great to see you, Autumn. And it's good to just be here for this podcast recording. We've powered through some technical difficulties this morning, and we are ready to roll. So This is going to be a fun conversation.
Yes. Should I describe the technical difficulties?
Well, all our listeners need to know is that Jesse, our technical director and producer, had some things not set up quite right when we rolled in, and we got it fixed.
Yeah, we've been through this before, Hunter, that sarcasm doesn't always read well on the podcast. And for our listeners, I think a more apt description would be Hunter disrupted the setup of the microphones, and then Jesse fixed it, which is one of Jesse's regular roles on our staff team, is to fix a lot of things that the rest of us don't really know how to fix.
We all have different ways of making sense out of what we experience. So that's your story.
So we'll just agree to disagree on the description of what just occurred here. Well, I always say in our opening introductory lines in the podcast that this is an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large, because we hope that people send us questions and suggestions about what they'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast. Some weeks, though, I'm having those discussions with people who are not actually pastors of Fellowship Denver. This week, I am discussing it with both of you who are our pastors here at Fellowship Denver. Today, we're talking about a book called A Time to Build that Dave actually brought to my attention initially. And so I'm wondering if, Hunter, if you would introduce our discussion today and tell us a bit about the book.
Yeah, Dave brought this to my attention too. And the book is about what's wrong with our political life. And by political life, I don't mean our electoral politics, the Republican and Democrat kind, or what happens in Congress, although he does talk about that. But I mean that term more broadly. And if listeners have listened to us talk about politics in the past, they would know we use the term politics to refer to our common life as a society, how we organize our common life. And Yuval Levin, the author of this book, is diagnosing something that he sees that is contributing to the malformation or the dissolution of our common life in the world. So it's primarily a diagnosis, although he talks about how he proposes that we fix it. And it's a diagnosis that I haven't heard before. So this book might not be a comprehensive, here's a theory of everything that's wrong, or every way that's contributed to malformation of our political life. But he's putting his finger on something that I haven't heard anywhere else. And when Dave summarized the book for me, and then I went and read it, I thought he's really got some insight here that I think would be fascinating for us to discuss.
Dave, what about the book did you find really compelling?
What I like about it is that it provides a mindset shift on how we view common institutions in our day. So part of what he highlights is the chaos and apparent sort of relational breakdown that's happening sort of at all different levels of society. And he's basically saying that is really a fruit of institutional instability. And that the problem isn't just the failure of the institutions, but it's also the failure sort of on a societal basis of how we respond to the importance of institutions and how we think about those institutions as either the source of the problem, therefore we have to just burn them down, or maybe they are actually can be part of the solution as well of our of our sort of society-wide issue. So Pastor Brad Edwards up at the table, he and I talked about this book I think a year or so ago, and he turned me on to this book too, just to give him credit for this. So I appreciate his insight. But it was really helpful for me because it provided a good diagnosis of what's wrong and a slightly different vision for what to do about it.
So his diagnosis of what's wrong with our political life is that our institutions have been weakened. And we'll talk about what he means by institutions, and we'll talk about the ways he sees they've been weakened. He has one particular diagnosis that he really drives throughout the book. The title of the book, therefore, A Time to Build, means a time to build or rebuild institutions. And so maybe it would be helpful if we talk about what he means by institutions and what he sees as the problem with them that needs to be rebuilt.
Yes, this is uniquely focused. His work in this book is uniquely focused on the crisis of institutions that we're experiencing in America, his diagnosis of it, and his suggested path forward. The subtitle of the book is helpful as an explanation of the content of the book. So the full title is A Time to Build, from family and community to Congress and the campus, how recommitting to our institutions can revive the American dream. So let's pick up with that question that you just mentioned, Hunter. How does Levin describe or define an institution? Because it's pertinent to then the rest of what he develops in the book.
An institution is anything we build together. It has more than one person involved. We build it together. And it tends to have a durable life over time. So it can be as simple as a marriage or a family. That is the basic institution of society. It can be as complex as a university, or it can be as complex as a magazine or a newspaper or a church or a hospital. These are institutions as well. So we all live our life within some institutions. I could probably just do a quick inventory off the top of my head and say, I'm a pastor of a church, so I'm a leader of an institution.
You mentioned pastor. That's a profession.
That's a profession. That's a title. It's an institutional title. I'm part of an extended family. I don't have a nuclear family because I'm not married, but I have an extended family. That's an institution. It's a durable institution that's endured my whole life. That family. I serve in several other organizations. Like I serve on the board of an organization that plants churches all over the world. That's a collective common life that we organize for the purpose of perpetuating church planting all over the world. That's an institution. So we can probably just inventory and think of institutions that we are part of or that are an integral part of our lives. Your kids go to school, so you have a relationship with the institutions that are their schools.
He also mentions, which I wonder if you could speak to a bit, Dave, that institutions are particularly important and foundational because they structure our lives.
That's right. They provide the sort of the common rules, the norms or habits. He mentions all of these things as the framework that helps to determine how it is we relate to each other. So not necessarily explicit rules, although sometimes they're mentioned depending on the institution, but they do train you in what those behavioral patterns ought to be. And you know when you've deviated from it, there's some kind of resistance that you experience when you deviate from it. So I think a classic institution that we all experience is the grocery store. And because we've all been to the grocery store, it has a particular structure and movement and flow, and there are rules to the grocery store, and there's also sort of a logical pattern to it, and it dictates and determines in some respect how it is that we embody that place. And so we know how to get our foods and we know that there's a certain way to check out, and that there's lines involved, and there's an order that emerges when you just see a grocery store because we've been institutionalized by it. Now, I will say my local grocery store, TJ's, reorganized.
Trader Joe's, for someone who's not on the inside of that acronym.
Reorganized the flow of its of its of its building and where they have all their items, it caused mass chaos. And it's taken now almost 2 years to restore order to that Trader Joe's.
I can't find anything in there anyway.
Well, there for about 2 years, everyone was just sort of wandering aimlessly in that
I don't
place.
go to Trader Joe's because I don't understand it. And you have to know what you're looking for. It's like I'm looking for the frozen cheesy straws, and they're going to be in the freezer section, and they're going to look like this. I just don't know that. And so it's just massively confusing to me. And so I just quit going.
See, institutional failure, right?
Yeah.
You were not formed or shaped by Trader Joe's.
I've never been formed or shaped. That's right.
He mentions two aspects or characteristics, these elements that unite all institutions. The first is what Hunter mentioned, they're durable. So in that examination of schools, marriages, churches, different organizations, institutions that are part of one of these aspects is that they are durable forms of our common life. And the second, what you were just mentioning, Dave, is that they provide framework and structure for our lives. So they are a form of association.
Yes.
You mentioned that they help us know how to relate to each other.
Right.
And
it's an internal logic.
Yes. Yes.
Of it. A good institution helps you make sense. And there's sort of, that seems logical for this to follow that, to follow that.
And one of the things he points out in the book, he uses the word formative. These institutions form us and they shape us. And they do that by constraining us and also enabling us. I can think of a couple of formative institutions that I took part in. One was when I was 18 years old, and I pledged my life to a fraternity in college. And this institution was durable in the sense that it had actually had multiple generations of young men who had passed through this fraternity and had been handed off to the next generation, which is amazing because for 18 to 22-year-olds to have anything durable is kind of funny in and of itself, although it was overseen by just slightly more mature adults who formed our board. But it was a formative institution. It was meant to shape young men with the social habits that they would need to flourish in upper crust Arkansas society. That's really what this institution did. And one of the first things they did for the freshmen was they helped you learn how to dress. And most freshmen coming to college did not know how to dress. And so there was this kind of ritual that was an informal ritual. It wasn't the fraternity had formal rituals, but there was also this informal hazing ritual, really, where the upperclassmen would evaluate the freshmen's pledges clothes, and they would separate them into yes and no buckets. And, you know, the big joke was like, some of my friends got all their clothes put in the no bucket. And one of my friends, they went to his room one day when he was at class, and he had two closets in his room, and they put some of his clothes in one closet and just a couple of his shirts in another closet, and they spray painted yes on one closet and no on the other closet. And they were teaching him how to dress. He came from a farm town, and he didn't know how to dress for the social world he had moved into. And so they like took his football jersey from high school and they put it in the no bucket. They're like, you can't wear that anymore, that out in public. And so they were shaping and forming. And it is interesting how you could say that was good or bad or whatever, but it was interesting how it didn't take you but a few months in the fraternity and your social manners were actually elevated. Now, in some ways, your social manners deteriorated too, but when you went out in public, you actually looked better and you knew how to act. They had training on how to go on a date, and upperclassmen would come and say, "Here's what you do when you take a girl out," and so it was shaping and forming young men. Another formative institution I went into after college was an accounting firm. This accounting firm had Midwest roots in Chicago, so it kind of had Midwestern values. It was called Arthur Andersen, and it was very conservative in how you dressed. So they sent you to school in your first month working for the firm. And the school included classes on professional dress. It included classes on professional manners, like how do you email, how do you write a professional email. It included classes on eating out. What do? You put your napkin in your lap as soon as you sit down at the table when you eat out. You do not let that thing sit on the table. If you need to get up and go to the restroom, you put your napkin in the chair and you ask to be excused for a minute. Like they trained you. This is where the forks go. This is where, so that you wouldn't make a fool of yourself when you were entertaining clients, at a nice restaurant. It's a formative and shaping institution. An informal rule in that institution was you do not bring your lunch to work. So you're not getting paid well when you start out, but somehow you've got to figure out how to eat out every day because they wanted you to be out in public, to be seen. They wanted their employees and their workers to be seen out in the downtown Dallas area eating lunch. And so it was just one of the rules. You don't bring your lunch.
So institutions create expectations. They
right.
define roles. They make sense of what you're supposed to do, function. They shape all of that.
They're formative and shaping. That's right. And so you start to look a certain way, act a certain way, know that certain things are okay and other things are not okay within the life of that institution. You typically, you don't take all of those values into the rest of your life, but you do start to appreciate some ways of living or behaving that you might not have just learned on your own, and you start to take those into other areas of your life. So even though I'm not working for the accounting firm anymore and I don't have to dress up in a suit and tie, I still kind of have an ethos that if I'm going to leave the house to go to work, I'm going to have a certain way I look outside my home that's different than what I look inside my home or how I might dress inside my home. If I go to dinner, I'm going to put my napkin in my lap as soon as I sit down. Like I found value in kind of these customs outside of that particular application. This is a way that I'm still shaped by that institution.
So it's fascinating because what you've talked about is the constraining aspects. Mm-hmm. Do this, don't do that. But then now that you're not a part of that firm anymore, you have all the freedom in the world to eat and to present yourself however the heck you want to. And yet with that freedom, though, you feel you've been shaped into what to do with that freedom. And so that's kind of the impact. It's constraining. And what do I do now that I've been given freedom? I'm no longer within those constraints. What kind of person am I? How have I actually been shaped in such a way to use all of the options that are available to me in a way that's responsible, in a way that has some common good to it?
That's right.
That's an aspect that Levin points out about institutions that is character formation as well. So there's these behavioral adaptations and constraints that are placed externally upon you to which you have to conform while you're a part of that institution. You can adapt those as you're observing, Dave, when you leave the institution. But in that process, also as you're weighing the values that are a part of the institution by which you're being shaped and determining if those align with your personal values, you're also forming character within the context of that institution.
That's right. Your values themselves are being shaped, and what it is that you think is important and meaningful and a net add to society. Those things are being shaped within the constraining formational process that you get in the institution.
Dave, you and I also met in an institution called a seminary, which is a graduate school, and that seminary had a particular customs that we had to adapt to, and it was meant to help you maximize the time you had there as a learning experience. And even if we don't practice all of the same customs we learned at seminary, by practicing those while we were there, we were shaped and formed by that institution, and we learned a lot as a result of being there.
And Fellowship Denver is a different kind of place because of it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For example, our institution, Dallas Theological Seminary, that both of us went to, spent 4 years of our life being shaped by that place. They have such an emphasis on the teaching of God's Word and an emphasis on the Bible. And even when you preach it, you you want to be able to preach it to where you don't have it memorized, but you have it mastered, and there's no notes, and there is an expectation of understanding of the text and the authority of the text that you can't help but being shaped by. That even though maybe some of the theological uniqueness of Dallas Seminary hasn't stuck with us in their eschatology necessarily, for example, but their value of God's word itself, it's made a mark that will never go away. And we see it here at Fellowship Denver or everywhere else we go.
My whole approach to preaching, your whole approach to preaching is shaped by that institution.
Yeah.
And it starts with the question, what is this passage saying? We don't preach anything until we understand what that passage is saying. And then whatever we preach from that passage has to be what that passage is saying.
Yeah.
and
That's the
and the
foundation.
applications of it, right?
Yeah.
So,
otherwise, it's not biblical.
yeah, we don't come to the Bible and go, what do we want to preach on? What do we feel like people need today? We rather go, let's study this passage. Let's pull out the message that's there. Let's explain that to people. And we learn that inside that institution, right?
That value was instilled in us.
I think it's particularly important to see family as an institution through this lens, because one of the critical aspects of family life together, although not all families have or are raising children, but for those who do, this is a crucial part of how you see your existence as a family, and part of the necessity of the institution of family as being formative for your children in all of these ways, and helping them navigate the society in terms of their behavior, how they relate to the people around them, how to navigate a school classroom starts really with their formation at home. And then you're also simultaneously developing character in them. So you're helping them know how to navigate different spaces, how to interact with different people. And then also, as you're doing that, helping them form and be shaped and formed by developing certain characteristics and character traits.
That's right. And it's defining roles and what's my purpose and what's my function within my little family. So whether it's husband and wife or with the kids, part of that, of the structure around that family is helping them make sense of how they interact with each other and rules of engagement. And then that sort of spreads out into other relationships outside of family as well. But yeah, it is foundational and structure and formational in its essence. It turns you into a certain kind of person.
This is why I think I will sometimes hear pastors say, or Christian leaders say, that marriage is one of God's tools for sanctifying people. And even if we could say, okay, theologically, I don't know that you can draw that line exactly from the Bible. And there's many ways to be sanctified, not just getting married. Mm-hmm. I would hope that as an unmarried man. But there's the truth to that is, when a young man and young woman get married, when any man, woman, they don't have to be young, but when they get married, they start to have to ask the question, like, okay, now that I'm married, can I do this and stay in good relation with my spouse, right? And it starts to constrain them in one sense. Mm-hmm. There's just things that they are outside of possibility for them, or things that they wouldn't have had to ask questions about when they were not married, that they now have to. It's more of a negotiation. So if I go on this, trip with my guy friends skiing, then I'm going to have to, let my wife go on a girls' trip. Right? And there's some trade-offs there, right? And all these things begin to happen. So in one sense, they can feel constraining, and when people feel overly constrained, that's where they start talking about the ball and chain of marriage, right? But in another way, they are liberating, because in constraining these young men and women, they then get to give themselves to the creation of a family, which is an institution that's hopefully going to endure and shape other people and give life to the world for more than one generation to come. So there's a short-term constraint and a long-term liberation, we might say.
That's right. Tim Keller would call it a civilizing effect of marriage, of covenant, that it actually historically is, especially kind of looking at men in particular, like civilizes them. It imputes them with the kind of nobility that they wouldn't have without those kinds of constraints.
So Levin is observing, and obviously his observation is resonating with us because we can see that displayed in our conversation here, that institutions are the durable forms, provide this durable form of our common life together.
That was a nice way of saying we're rambling.
and they also structure our lives such that we can develop expectations, understand ways to go about life, know how to associate with others. Institutions provide that sort of structural framework for our life together. They're how we gain and sustain the habits and assumptions, networks, and mental maps that enable us to thrive. And as you just said, Hunter, via your illustration of marriage as an institution, to be at the same time free and responsible, or constrained, but also free. So if institutions are an incredibly important foundational aspect of our shared life that enable us to know how to interact with each other and the world around us, I think then it's not difficult to see why, if institutions are in crisis, we may feel that some of those foundations are shaken. Mm-hmm. So let's move into what is Levin's diagnosis of why are institutions weak or weakening? Why are we at this moment of crisis?
What we are tempted to say is they're weakening because of corruption within the institutions, and we can all see that. But he actually has a different thing he wants to put his finger on. He's not denying that our institutions are often corrupted by abuses of power and this kind of thing. But in some ways, I think he's even diagnosing what the problem underneath that might be. And his theory is this: we have turned institutions into platforms for displaying and promoting individuals rather than their original purpose, which was to mold and to shape individuals into a common picture. So much like individualism, which prioritizes the individual and the individual's aspirations, much like individualism has shaped a lot of things, like to take marriage, for example, it is very common that people will ask the question of their marriage, is this marriage helping me become the best version of myself, rather than is this marriage becoming healthier and healthier as a marriage so we can give life to the world. In the same way, individuals will engage with institutions primarily as a stage or a platform they can stand on that will help them get their voice out there or get their vision out there or promote their brand or their agenda. And by turning institutions into platforms for individuals rather than molds that constrain the individuals, Levin is noticing that our institutions have been weakened because they are really only now as strong as the individual who they're platforming, and they are very much subject to, if that individual fails, the institution fails.
He's also noticing that sort of the cynicism that people have towards institutions is often due to the fact that the person on the platform has a life and character that's contrary to the very formational values of the institution that they're being platformed by. And so people sort of from the outside can look at the individual and as a terrible kind of, as a terrible example morally of the values that they claim to represent. And so then that creates that cynicism, that doubt on the entire thing. And rather than noticing the structural problem of the platforming agent itself.
Just in our own field of work, Dave, pastors can easily treat their churches as platforms by which they primarily are promoting their personal beliefs and agenda. And then for pastors who begin to have a following that's bigger than their church, they can treat the church as a platform to grow their following out in the wider world. And we're not saying that pastors shouldn't have a following outside their church or shouldn't have a ministry that's bigger than just their local church, because historically that's happened for a long time, where there have been a subset of pastors in every society who have had wider ministries than just their local church. But there seems to be something happening in the last 20 or so years where that seems to be even more important to folks than the local ministry of the church itself.
That's right. I mean, if you and I were to write a book by any major Christian publisher, we would be given a little booklet as authors to show us how to platform our church. I know it because I've seen these. Mm-hmm. And with the game plan, this is how you platform. And this is how you utilize your congregation to put you in a position to be able to sell your books. So this is a marketing kind of framework that's been around, for quite a long time. But I think especially with the rise of social media, which he gets into, now the temptation to platform and the pathway to platform is so ubiquitous that it becomes sort of the default now of what it means to lead or even be part of an institution. Is what is it that we're saying about it, or how is it that we're utilizing it? Or, and this is another big diagnosis that he has, not people who are platformed by institutions, but for people who are the outsiders, people who are like, I'm not formed by any institution. I'm the one who's rebelling, who's protesting, who's going against the obvious evils of the institution. So they're sort of kind of outside the institution, kind of with no real allegiances necessarily. And he's saying, well, that's actually, while maybe some of the things they're saying about the institution may be true and important, it causes destabilization society-wise if that becomes your default position, that you're always the one outside of the institution throwing rocks. He's like, that's not good ultimately for society.
Yet some of those people who are outside an institution and making those observations that might resonate because of our inherent mistrust of institutions right now use that their very stance against the institution as a means of platform, because through social media we can build individual platforms.
That's right.
Now,
that's right. And then he says that the social media complex is itself a deforming agent, that it's an anti-institution, that it sort of gives you voice without shape. He says that it actually, rather than forming, it actually firms you. So rather than shaping you into a kind of person, it actually reinforces whatever prejudice you happen to already have. So it doesn't shape you or form you into sort of a virtue. It just reinforces whatever one's perspective happens to be and firms you. Reinforces whatever that is.
Hardens
so
you.
It hardens you, yeah.
Yeah. He also gives the example of, you can see how this has happened in journalism. Journalists often use the institution they work for as just a platform to build their personal journalistic brand, and they'll change platforms when they need to. And so he's noticed that, for example, even a very prestigious and durable institution like a major newspaper like a New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, all the journalists will have a Twitter account by which they're promoting their own personal brand and viewpoint, not so much the newspaper they work for. And they often switch allegiances when needed to advance their platform. I was just reading the election coverage on Twitter of a local journalist who I followed for years, and I noticed that this journalist was sounding much more like just a partisan political operative than I had noticed in the past. I was like, wow, it seems like he's really just kind of cheerleading for one party. And I clicked on his bio and I noticed, he no longer works for the Denver Post. He now works for some newsletter that he writes himself, right? And it's a classic. But I had become his follower because he was a well respected political reporter for the Denver Post covering Colorado politics. That's why I originally started following him on Twitter, and I didn't even notice he had switched institutions, or really left the institution, the Denver Post, and for no institution at all, and is kind of a freelancer now. And that has drastically changed the voice that he's bringing.
This dynamic, Levin's central insight here, that an institution, our perspective of institutions, our use of institutions has been transformed from a place, an organization, or a group of people, an association of people that forms and shapes us into a platform by which we might experience some sort of power or prominence or recognition. And this can happen, as you observed, in a church. A pastor can utilize their church as a platform, unfortunately, and we see that happens and destroys individuals and churches. A journalist can use their institution as a means of platform to advance their own personal brand. He offers up illustrations of how this has happened and is happening in Congress, why mistrust is so rampant, mistrust of Congress is so rampant in our society, because we see politicians using the institution of Congress not as a way to legislate and improve society and work together and form associations by which they and then our general public can be shaped, but they use it instead as a means of personal power and accomplishment.
So if we had to summarize kind of his diagnosis, he's saying institutions have historically shaped our common life and given it a durable form over multiple generations that shapes men and women, forms them for life in the world by, on the one hand, constraining them, but in constraining them, also helping them develop habits and insights and expertises that they would not be able to develop on their own. So that's part one. Part two, but today institutions have become less formative. They are less given to forming people into a certain mold, and they're more given to letting people use them as platforms for whatever they want them to be, right? So they have let go of their formative responsibility and more said, to use my accounting firm example, it would be like, well, you dress however you want to, and you can bring your lunch if you want to, rather than kind of tell me how I had to live and the habits I had to develop. So they become platforms for people. And then something is lost in that. And the last thing he notes is this has a social impact. And the social impact is institutions have historically acted as shock absorbers for a lot of the tensions and the anxiousness and the different viewpoints that are within our world. And they contain within themselves a lot of the tension, but when they're weakened, they don't contain that tension, so it just spills out into the world that we live in. And so part of the reason why we experience the world as more fragmented and more volatile and not as life-giving of a place to be is because these institutions have quit absorbing the shock that they used to absorb.
That particular explanation, what you mentioned, Hunter, about institutions being shock absorbers functioning this way in our society, was a really prescient point. It was one thing that was revelatory to me and really helpful in Levin's diagnosis, in that our current troubles feel more dire than they actually are. If we look at them in light of a comparison to historical events, historical crises, or even our current statistics, our social statistics, our economic statistics, all suggest that, yeah, this might be a time of some pressure, but the general feeling of anxiety and unrest, the sense that something is wrong, is greater than all of those other factors suggest they should be. So here's where we're at. Levin has said institutions are an undeniably important structure for our society. They help us know how to interact with each other. They provide this durable form in our society that shapes individuals and gives structure to our common life together. Institutions currently are functioning more as platforms, and they're creating opportunities, or people are utilizing them to create opportunities for celebrity, which inherently misshapes or deforms the character of the institution itself. And that has a destabilizing effect socially. And so then when a crisis occurs, because the institutions are unable to support the weight of that, our sense is that things are actually really dire, when perhaps, in fact, they're not as dire as our sense of it is.
Or perhaps they put the pressure of figuring these dire questions out, or these important questions out, they put them back on individuals and families rather than absorbing them within the life of the institution. I was reading an example of this last week. There's a prominent Christian university in Michigan, Calvin University, and Calvin University is a branch of, or it's run by, the Christian Reformed Church denomination. And this denomination has a historic confession of faith that they subscribe to, and for generations, families could send their kids to Calvin University knowing that their kids were going to be taught from a standpoint of professors who subscribe to the denomination's historic confession of faith. And recently, like in many denominations, the question of sexuality has become debated. And earlier this year, the Christian Reformed Church affirmed their commitment to kind of what we might call historic biblical orthodox understanding of sexuality. So they articulated that. They even elevated to what they called confessional status, which means we think this is essential to our standing as a Christian institution and to our messaging to be historically and consistently Christian. When they did that, it became known that some faculty members at the university didn't hold to that standard. They didn't agree with the historic Christian understanding of sexuality. They had adopted some new views. And so then they had this debate about, are we going to let these faculty members continue on or not? And the faculty members that had different views, most of them also had what we might call large platforms. They had, through their writing, through their speaking, through their outside teaching, they had developed followings that were really big, and they were kind of the quote rock stars of the faculty. They're the ones that people, when they think of Calvin University, they're like, we want to go to Calvin to study under these professors. Or publicly, they're associated with the university. So they had to decide, what are we going to do? And they decided to allow these faculty members to hold their unorthodox views and still remain on the faculty. So this is an example of institutional authority or institutional shaping and molding, where we have a confession of faith that's been handed down for generations. We're going to subscribe to this understanding. It's an example of that kind of durable institutionality being sacrificed for the sake of maintaining peace with these larger platform professors. And so now think about what just the pressure that introduces to Calvin University's constituency. Now, all the
and
families,
their students.
That's right, all the families and all the students who are thinking about sending their kids to Calvin, they now have to interact with it in a completely different way than they literally did last year, right? So that has a massive destabilizing effect. Whether you think they should have done that or shouldn't have done that, whatever your view on sexuality is, we could all agree that's a pretty big shock to the system. And this is just an example of what Levin is talking about, where the platform of this handful of prominent professors really became the biggest factor in the institution's decision making rather than their institutional standards.
Dave, I wonder if you could speak to for a moment how it is that part of this progression happened, which Levin examines a bit. He mentions that mistrust in institutions is understandable, as we've already briefly discussed, because sometimes there's actual corruption within the institution itself. Sometimes, as you also mentioned, Dave, a celebrity leader or a leader with a large platform or a leader who's utilizing the institution that way fails to live in line with the values and ideals of the institution itself. And that creates mistrust because they are this figurehead or representative that's standing on this institution as a platform. But he mentions a couple of other ideas, and I wonder if you could reintroduce those for us as to why this dynamic may have occurred, what the progression looked like.
Well, I mean, as Christians, we can all go back to Jesus and look at how he responded to the institutional kind of realities of his day. And his greatest criticism of the Jewish leaders and the Judaism that he grew up in and had conflict with was hypocrisy, was you're behaving in a way that's contradictory to the foundations that you're sitting on. And a lot of his message wasn't against the Jewish law. It wasn't against how God had revealed himself among the Jewish people for generations, but it was against the ways in which those laws were now being utilized and practiced that led people astray, that perverted the institutional function or norms within Judaism, and he called it out. So, and so as Christians, we inherit a part of our inheritance is language of protest against institutions and people who lead institutions who are contrary to the function or value or purpose or the charter of the institution itself. So, and so part of what Levin describes in terms of kind of what to do about it isn't anything that should be unusual to those of us who have read the New Testament or follow Jesus. Part of it is a call back to integrity. It's a call to forgiveness and restoration to its original concept or norms within sort of church societal life together. And you know, Autumn, yesterday you and I were talking. We taught on biblical leadership yesterday in another context, and reminding people afresh of the importance of honesty and integrity and truth with love. These aren't new ideas, but they are critical in order to help institutions get reoriented to their original form and function.
I think the last idea that I want to mention is that he also brings out our understanding, our assumed understanding of freedom. And if we are going to, as we'll discuss more in our next episode when we discuss the rest of this book, so this is part one of a two-part discussion. In our second discussion, we'll pick up on the idea that Dave just shared about recapturing some of those necessary characteristics for institutions to thrive, to be stable, to bring stability to the people within them, and to provide, again, that structure for our lives and our society. The last idea that I think he mentions that's important to capture here is that we might be participating in the destruction of or deformation of institutions if we allow our concept of individual freedom to be shaped more by the current moment than by the Bible's understanding of individual freedom, which is freedom so that we can use our autonomy on behalf of other people to build up others. So A, that, and B, more of a historical recapturing of the idea of freedom. So I'm going to read a quote from the beginning, towards the beginning of the book, in which he introduces this idea, how we're participating in the deformation of it if we assume this idea, the current cultural idea of freedom. Maybe what we resist most is the very idea that we would need to be formed by institutions at all. The liberal ideal of freedom that has often been at the core of our political imagination is rooted in the premise that the choosing individual is the foundation of our social order. Liberating that person, whether from oppression, necessity, coercion, or constraint, has frequently been understood to be the foremost purpose of our politics. Our parties have argued about how to do it and about what kind of liberation the individual most desires or requires, but they have agreed, at least implicitly, that once properly liberated, that person could be free. There is, of course, a deeper, older idea of freedom that contends that in order to be free, we need more than just to be liberated. We need to be formed for freedom, given the tools of judgment and character and habit to use our freedom responsibly and effectively. Such formation for freedom is a key part of what our institutions are for, starting with the family and spreading outward to the institutions through which we work, learn, worship, govern, and otherwise organize ourselves. So this is the idea I want to send us out with today, that we can examine our own participation in this in one way or the other, our own participation in the misshapenness of an institution, or by recapturing and regaining a spirit of the institution that you introduced for us via this example of Jesus, Dave, that we can also participate in the strengthening of those institutions and therefore in the strengthening and building up of the people who are a part of them. Well, Hunter, Dave, thanks for joining me today. I look forward to our next conversation, in which we'll not only examine Levin's diagnosis of what is wrong, why our institutions are experiencing a particular crisis right now, but how it is that we go about recommitting to and strengthening them.
Can't wait.
Look forward to it.
If you have questions or suggestions about today's episode, or an idea about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.